I want to talk about wokery again and be joined by our friend from Spiked Online, the editor there, social commentator Brendan O'Neill. Good evening, Brendan.
Hi, Kevin.
We are here, of course, to talk about this investigation by King's College in London that cancel culture and wokery is actually a pernicious scourge, and that if we're not careful, we could follow America into a kind of abyss of wokery, which, although it's funny and absurd quite often, yesterday French food was dismissed as racist, it is actually a dangerous and divisive device being used by the woke warriors to cause all sorts of problems for our society. It's a very divisive thing. But something's just cropped up, and I've got to run this past you. I was just talking to school campaigners who were dismayed by an organisation called Just Like Us. They have sent out exam papers to schools all over the country, and this has been endorsed by the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, and it's also sponsored by Facebook, and this is for 5 to 7 year olds, and here's one of the questions. I'd love to get your comments on it. Problem 1. Harley, a non-binary and Harley, a non-binary and gender non-conforming person using the they-them pronouns, has volunteered to give bottles of water to runners of a marathon. They have 15 bottles of water, but there are a total of 25 runners in the marathon. How many more bottles of water does Harley need to buy? Do you see the irrelevant aspect of that question? It's unbelievable, isn't it?
That is unbelievable, because that's really a case of sneaking this stuff into everything that kids do and to all kinds of schoolwork. I mean, it has no relevance whatsoever to that question. That's a maths question. We'll all be familiar with questions like that from when we were at school. You don't need to add non-binary, gender non-conforming people. It's just propaganda being snuck in the back door. But I think you're absolutely right. And this new study is very interesting, because what it says is that even though most people don't have time for wokeness, many people don't really understand what the word woke means, they nonetheless, that the noisy woke mobs could have a very destructive impact on society. And that's such an important point. You know, I get a real kick out of making fun of the excesses of wokeness, because it is very, very funny sometimes. But there is also a serious side, which is that this kind of divisive identitarian politics is increasingly influential, especially in institutions, and it's going to impact on the next generation in particular and cause them to have some pretty regressive views that could harm society.
Yeah, and here's another one of these maths questions, because it feeds into the wokery that we're talking about, the divisive wokery. As I say, stressing that this is a question for 5 to 7 year olds in British schools. Jas, a gender non-conforming person using she, her pronouns, is making an apple pie for their friends and family, etc., etc. I mean, the point about this is not only is it sponsored by Facebook, which should have a real look at it, it's also endorsed by Gavin Williamson and the Education Department. So that's what we're talking about. That is why this kind of wokery is divisive and dangerous, because the authorities don't have the guts to challenge it.
That's exactly right. You know, we all have a tendency to see the woke culture warriors as just these blue-haired weirdos who, you know, did queer studies or media studies or some other weird thing at university and are rather overeducated in things that are not particularly useful, and who want to censor everyone and scream at cis men and have a go at white men. And, you know, of course, those people exist. They're online, they're on campuses, they're making a loud noise in public debate. But the far larger problem is the capitulation of institutions, the way in which institutions fail to stand up to these people. So even the education department has failed to stand up to these people. We know that Stonewall, for example, was successful for quite a long time in getting its crazy new gender speak into government departments, into police forces, and into other institutions around the country. That's now being rethought, and lots of people are pulling out of that. But across the board, in the police service, the government departments, institutions, art galleries, all sorts of contemporary organizations, there is this capitulation to wokeness and this embrace of ideas that most people consider to be quite batty.
How do you teach children the sort of basic facts of life and or grammar when you say that non-binary person over there must be addressed as they or them. How do you explain to them that that singular entity must be addressed in the plural? How do you teach grammar under those circumstances?
Well, you can't. That's a really important point. The they them pronouns. If you ever read a newspaper article about someone who is they them, it just makes no sense. I mean, you just keep tripping up over words and sentences, thinking, "Hold on, who are they talking about? What's going on here?" So that, I think, is a very important point. This wokeness is a crime against grammar as well as a crime against reality and reason. And the problem is that there are so many basic things that children will fail to learn as a consequence of these ideologies. So biological sex is out the window. You're no longer allowed to talk about men and women. You're no longer allowed to say that someone with a penis is a man and someone who is with a vagina who can give birth is a woman. That's a bad thing to say these days. Of course, you have to use they, them if someone demands it, which is completely undermines grammar and basic English. So English, science, all these kind of reasoned things that we are supposed to teach kids, all of that stuff is undermined by this Orwellian war on language. So across the board, I think this kind of ideology is having a destructive impact on how we socialize and educate the next generation.
I had a guest on last week who had, quite rightly in my view, pointed out that this retain and explain philosophy, whereby if you have a statue of somebody who was connected to the slave industry, instead of throwing it into the sea or pulling it down because it's so heinous, you put a sort of plaque or a notice to explain their connection to the slavery, and therefore that enables you to retain. And he said, quite rightly in my view, that is complete capitulation to wokery. That's what they want. I then went on to ask him, I said, well, who's behind all this? I said, there must be somebody kind of planning this. He said that he thought that it was just sort of loudmouth big heads who sort of wanted to be in the news. But I've got to admit, Brendan, I feel a little bit more suspicious than that. I think there must be some people planning this kind of stuff.
Well, it definitely feels like that sometimes. But I think probably one of the reasons it feels like that is because, apart from sensible people like you and a few others, there isn't much pushback, and there certainly isn't much institutional pushback. So it looks like these people have free rein. It looks like they can do pretty much anything they want. And I think the statues issue is really important, because what that reminds us is that this ideology is really a war on British history. It's a war on the traditions and the history and the stories of this country. And it's an attempt to depict this country as a racist cesspit full of racist idiots. And our history was just a litany of crimes, one horror after another. We all live in the shadow of empire, in the shadow of slavery, in the shadow of colonialism. We should self-flagellate for these crimes all the time. It promotes this incredibly downbeat message about the United Kingdom. It glosses over the fact that wonderful scientific, political, and social discoveries and leaps forward came from this country, and that there is an enormous amount for us to be proud of. So the anti-Britishness, the statue bashing, the flag bashing, the way that anyone who feels patriotic is looked down upon as an idiot, that is a central part of the woke ideology. And I think the reason that stuff is taking hold is not because it's an ideology shared by most people. It absolutely is not. But once again, it's because of the cowardice of the political establishment, who failed to stand up and say, listen, this is a good country. We have a good history. Let's stop beating ourselves up.
And this is why the woke warriors win when we retain and explain. If you go down to the Jane Austen Museum, which is her former house down in Hampshire, which she shared with her father, who was a vicar. That vicar, her dad had some kind of connection. He was a spiritual pastor to a plantation once in the Caribbean. So you go in there now. It said, well, before you admire Jane Austen, be aware that her father had a connection to slavery insofar as he was a pastor to a plantation, and that this great author, although initially you may admire her, she shamelessly wore cotton. Cotton was produced by slaves at plantations, and worse of all, she drank tea, which of course was produced by slaves in tea plantations. That's the retain and explain that allows the Jane Austen Museum to stay in position. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on this. I think that when they say let's have retain and explain, let's just put up notices telling everyone what horrible people these actually were. That's in some ways even worse than tearing statues down or tearing museums down, because what that does, it casts aspersions on pretty much everyone in British history, even a figure like Jane Austen, an inoffensive novelist, one of the great novelists in English history. She can now be demonized as someone who had some vague connection to slavery and therefore was an evil person. The thing that made me laugh is that the British Library even did that with Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes, of course, was the great poet laureate of the mid to late 20th century. You know, he's a very recent poet, very recent public figure. And they said, well, he had an ancestor who was involved in the slave trade, so that's a bit iffy as well. So you have the sins of the father being visited upon the son, or the great, 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 great grandson. So the retain and explain thing, this plastering of notices across the British Museum, the British Library, Jane Austen Museum, what that really is about is saying, listen, this is a horrible country full of horrible people, and you have to face up to that fact. Your heroes were nasty individuals. And that is such a negative, depressing, anti-patriotic message that I think is winding up a lot of people.
I agree. Retain and explain is not a compromise solution to this problem. It is a victory for the woke warriors, pure and simple. And don't forget that Ted Hughes was, of course, dismissed as a terrible beneficiary of slavery. I mean, the guy was born above a newsagent's in the north. You know, he was a working class guy. He was no beneficiary at all. Last question, Brendan. We always come to this, but this government has made it very clear it intends to stand up to this woke madness that, as we've established, is not just funny and absurd, but very pernicious and divisive. And here we are discussing more and more egregious examples of it. And not only are they egregious examples, they're backed up and endorsed by the Education Department, endorsed by politicians, by Tory politicians. So they keep talking the talk, but they don't walk the walk. When are they going to do something about this?
Well, that's the big question of our time in many ways. I think we have a situation where the Conservative Party has won the political war. It's doing very well in votes, in electoral contests. And of course, it is still popular in the opinion polls. But it is losing the culture war. It is losing the war for British history and the war to protect the idea of the United Kingdom as a good, positive country to live in. It's losing that war because the kind of people who run media organizations and cultural institutions and, of course, universities tend to be these pseudo-left, regressive, woke culture warriors who look down their noses at ordinary people and the history of the country that we live in. So the government has got to take the culture war more seriously. It can't keep running away from this. It can't keep just saying we are going to do something about it at some point, but we're not sure when. It has got to take it more seriously. It should be fighting this war every single day. And then it would become even more popular and we might start a pushback against these regressive ideas.
Well, we're going to do our best to keep this pushback going. I feel sometimes, Brendan, we're yodeling into the abyss, but I'm not giving up and I know you're not either. Always a pleasure to talk. Thank you so much. Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online.